Welcome back to Face the Nation. Here's more of our conversation with women voters in Virginia. What do you think here in Virginia of the idea that two women are running against each other?
That's great. Airplane food, hospital food. Oh, what does that mean? That's funny. I get it. Kill you, but neither ones are worth it.
Have you made up your mind yet?
Yes.
Do you want to share with us?
I will vote for Barbara Comstock. I will hold my nose.
Indeed. That makes two of us.
And the three of you are going the other way with her.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wexton. Mm-hmm. And do you view that as a vote against Donald Trump when you go to vote for the Democratic candidate?
No, not necessarily. I live in Northern Virginia, like all of you, but I live in the Luckett's area. And I feel as if Barbara Comstock has not done enough to alleviate road concerns. I mean, just basic things that are going on in my community.
Iris, do you view this as a referendum on President Trump?
The whole election, it probably has been turned into that.
But when you're casting your vote, when you go into that voting
When I cast my vote, I usually cast my vote for, again, the person who I think is most likely to represent my values and my principles and to do good for the country, or in this case, the state of Virginia.
You all do think there will be a female president?
Oh, absolutely.
So
Yeah, eventually, I mean.
eventually, you know, I'm 50 years old and I'm thinking, I thought that possibly in November of 2016, we would have seen the first female president. I'm not sure that it will happen within the next 10 years. I don't believe it will happen.
Maria, you're our millennial in the group.
Awesome.
Are you feeling motivated this November in a way that perhaps you didn't in the past?
I think, in a way, yes. I think that the two-party system is so polarizing, and I think that a lot of people of my generation agree with that.
Do you think you've all become more politically interested or active since President Trump?
I have. I know I have. My family has become way more political. My sister, very introverted, she is out there. She's canvassing. She is creating her own PAC even because she is that motivated, and so am I. And I never really voted in an election. I wasn't registered to vote because I chose not to. I didn't want my data out there. Now I'm like, okay, have my data. But I have definitely become more political. And it is polarizing.
I've always been fascinated. I grew up in Michigan. My father was a very strong Union Democrat. And I was in middle school when the air traffic controllers went on strike. And President Reagan said, if you don't go back to work, you're going to be fired. And I was 10, 11, 12, I don't even remember. And my first thought was, well, if you don't go to work, then you should be fired. So those were conversations that I really couldn't have in my household. I definitely think one size does not fit all. So I have always been more issue driven.
Is the fact that a candidate is a woman or that she's a mother count as sort of a bonus for you? Do you view that as a positive thing?
No.
No, not in
Not
my case.
necessarily,
Not at all.
no.
Gender doesn't influence whether you favor a candidate.
It never has.
Almost never.
I'm trying to think if there's ever been an instance where I've just picked a woman over a man, and I don't believe that I have.
Yeah.
I think it's, again, it's an issue for me.
I think
It has
we're
to
issue
be.
voters, not.
At this point in time, really, women in politics is still very young. So as the time goes on and more women will have been political figures for longer, they're going to be stronger candidates. And so I believe for that reason that there will be a woman president, hopefully in the next 10 to 15 years.
I hope so.
Do you think that Washington would function better if there were more women in elected office?
No. I think that the swamp is so ingrained.
So none of you think that women act differently as leaders?
They do act differently as leaders. I am actually under a woman, several layers of women leadership. It's amazing. And I'm in the IT field, and that's what makes it even better. They are strong, and they are candid, and they actually care. Like, they really do care. But I think that when you get to Congress, what ends up happening, it's a job. Like it's a job. They forget their constituency. They do the same thing that a man senator or a male.
They can be just as corrupt.
But if there were more women, because the number's still relatively small, would that change?
It might change. It might change. I was in the military, right? And it was female in that, and so when we were all together, and when you have that camaraderie, you actually build each other up and you make each other stronger. But we all had the same goal, right? We were all going for the same goal. It's not the same in Congress. You're not all going for the same goal because you represent different people and their goals are different. So I don't think that it would be more. But I do agree with Maria. If the more women that are in there, the stronger that they will be.
Do all of you think that women are in a better place now than they were in 2016?
I do.
No, I don't think anyone is actually better. I really don't, especially when you're looking at friends and they say something and you're like, oh, you are that type of supporter, and then that just puts a distance between you, right? So no one's better, women or men, children, nobody's better. Animals, they're not better either. Nobody's better. Sorry.
Thank you, ladies, very much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Oh, appreciate it.
We'll be right back with our panel, so stay with us. We're back now with our political panel. Leslie Sanchez is a Republican strategist and CBS News political contributor. Ed O'Keefe is our political correspondent here at CBS. Amy Walter is the national editor of the Cook Political Report, and Anthony Salvanto is our director of elections and surveys, and he's here today with a batch of new poll numbers from the CBS News Battleground Tracker. So, Anthony, what has changed this summer?
The Democrats have moved into a stronger position to take back the House. We had them earlier this summer getting just over that magic number of 218. That's the number of seats you need to take the House. Here we have them inching up to 222, but I need to caution here. There's a margin of error around that, like there is with any poll on this estimate. And that margin of error still has a range where the Republicans could still hold the House. There are scenarios where that happens. What I want to emphasize is within that estimate, all these districts are very close. And we're looking at very small swings among these voters. Just a few more Republican women who are a little bit hesitant to say that they're going to back the Republican candidate. A lot of enthusiasm among Democrats, but some who haven't voted before. And so there's a lot of moving parts still here underneath that edge towards the Dems.
You mentioned women as a voting bloc. They don't all go in the same direction, but you are starting to see a real shift in how women are voting this election.
Yeah, one of the biggest breaks is if you look at the college, non-college difference. And we started to see this in the last presidential election. And in these districts, it's really important. There's a double-digit edge for Democrats among women with college degrees here. And they also tell us that they're more likely to say their vote is, as you heard in your panel, a vote against the president. And that's different from men who are more inclined to say they're voting in support of the president. And I should emphasize, these battleground districts are battlegrounds because they have relatively more college graduate women in them. So by definition, that's part of what's going on.
And Leslie, I guess the question then is for these college-educated women who maybe in the past have voted Republican, are they comfortable crossing over in this election, or do they stay in a partisan sort of position when they go to the voting booth?
Sure. So the president won about 40% of those college-educated. I always look at the other side, 60% of non-college educated. White women particularly were the ones that voted. So if you look at the pool, if they were white women, they were more inclined to vote for the president. So the dividing line really does come on race. If you're looking at Hispanic women, African American women, or women who are Republican in marriage, like they're married to, their family votes Republican, that's where you're going to see more of a dividing line. People talk a lot about the suburbs, maybe there'll be more ticket splitters. We talk about Barbara Comstock's race. Can she hold conservative, Republican-leaning, college-educated women? I think they can. I think at the end of the day that more of these folks will fall on the Republican camp than the Democratic one.
And how much of that is a Trump effect?
The most remarkable thing I think that's happening historically, and I know Anthony talks about this, you expect about 30 seats to be lost for the president's party in power. What the president's trying to do is defy history and basically say, can I nationalize my local Trump voters to support a local candidate? If he can do that and get out to all those states he wants to get to those last 30 days, that changes this from a referendum, which it normally is on the president's policies and his character, to a nationalized election saying that we fear open borders, we have a strong economy, you have to be patient and wait for the long-term effect.
And that's been the challenge. Leslie brings up a really good point about who's more motivated to vote in this election. And we've been seeing in all these special elections for the House, Democrats have been outperforming their traditional vote percentage. They have been turning out at a higher percentage. And my colleague looked at the last special election in Ohio, where you have a great combination. This is around the Columbus suburbs and the more rural parts of Ohio. In the Columbus suburbs, where you're going to see a lot of these voters like we saw here in suburban Virginia, they turned out at about 60% of their 2016 average. Okay, so they were turning out at a very high rate for a special election. In the very Trump rural parts of the district, remember Trump went into this district and campaigned, the vice president went into this district and campaigned, they only turned out at 40%. So there is also a limit, and I think there was one voter in there, I can't remember her name, who mentioned about, I'm going to vote for, I'm a Republican, but I'm going to vote for a Republican, but I really don't like Congress, right? And that's really the challenge is Trump's success was based on the fact that he trashed all of Congress, including Republican members of Congress, right? He spent most of 2017 attacking Mitch McConnell, attacking the ineptness of the Republicans in Congress to pass an Obamacare repeal. Now to go back into those voters and say, I know you like me and you like that I shake it up, but I need you to vote for these establishment hacks in Congress that I keep attacking. That's a very difficult thing to do.
We were in Ohio in that district for the special election 2 weeks ago, and it was just fascinating when you speak with women voters especially, how many of them unprompted were saying, I'm here because of the president. I am voting against the president. I want nothing to do with him or anyone who supports him. The polling backs that up. Something like, what is it, a majority say that the candidate must share their views on Donald Trump in order to get their vote. We were seeing that vividly every time we talked to a woman in that district. And, it just makes you wonder if you're hitting that 60% threshold, how this is going to, and you've talked about this, how much this is going to potentially scramble the traditional models that have been used to determine how many people are going to show up. If Democrats show up in far larger numbers, it totally scrambles things.
And Anthony, we were just showing a graphic there that I'd like you to explain a little bit. What are the issues that make people show up, particularly women? I know healthcare is something that polls very high.
It keeps popping up. Every time we give people an issue list, every time we say what is going to be the determinative thing, even if everybody's not talking about it in Washington, it keeps coming up in the polls. For women, then we ask specifically, what is it about healthcare? And it's costs. It's costs, and a lot of folks who say that they don't feel that the changes the Republican Congress has made so far have either affected them or affected them for the better. And I think that's one of the things when we talk about what voters are saying and doing versus what the national politics and campaigns are saying and doing, that does appear to be a little bit of a disconnect.
There's a huge disconnect. We saw this in our own assessment of the ads that have been run through the primaries from beginning of this year through the end of July. Democrats overwhelmingly talking about health care, much more than they're talking about Donald Trump.
I think that if anything, that's always been a blind spot for the Republican Party. They don't talk about health care. They think about it yes, it is in terms of cost, but women will say things like, I'm not going to get to go to the good doctor, now I'm assigned to the bad one. When they're talking about choice and doctors opting out, pre-existing condition, which we know Republicans and Democrats agree on, but there's this kind of myth out there that all of a sudden that pre-existing conditions wouldn't be covered if you went in and tried to change the current system. I think the other interesting part is no matter what policy, and that's kind of my question, no matter what policy you put forward, is not going to change women's verdict on the president's flawed character. That is consistent, and we ask, well, what if he does this and has more tax reform and does infrastructure? It's not going to matter on that.
And yet it isn't necessarily precluding them from voting Republican.
Exactly.
And as we heard from Congresswoman Noem, she seemed reluctant to directly criticize the president.
That might be more just because they're solid red conservative or solid Republicans. And the interesting part, if you contrast that, what are the Democrats giving them? If you look at a Gallup poll this week that talked about there's more of an openness and a more favorability for socialism than there ever has been for capitalism. That's the first time since 2010 that Democrats are starting to see that in a more positive light. What does that mean in contrast to Republicans, who are really much more capitalist oriented? They like the strong economy. At least it gives them a place to go.
Ed, I thought it was interesting in our conversation with those voters when I asked women about whether having more female representatives would sort of change Washington.
Yeah.
And they pretty much said, no, everyone's a swamp creature once they get there.
It is, and why I find that interesting is, in fact, if you look at recent congressional history, there is some evidence to suggest that women actually are pushing things along. There was a period a few years ago where you had women either running or the top partisan member of the Budget, Appropriations, Agriculture committees, and all of those big bills were moving at the same time, and they all got through with very little drama. And all of those members said part of the reason this happened is because women were pushing it along, were more willing to meet with their counterparts, were more willing to compromise, and remained laser focused on getting it done. So I would argue the reverse, that in fact, I think we have seen evidence in recent years that if women do get in there and end up in positions where they're moving the legislation along, things actually could get done a lot faster.
And Anthony, I know when you are asking questions, you're always very careful and specific in polling, in how you phrase things. You asked about Trump's handling of issues that affect women.
Right.
And I thought it was interesting in that focus group to hear people define what they thought a woman's issue was.
Yes.
You heard from Jackie, that Trump supporter, for her, all it meant was the economy. That's a human issue across the board.
Right. Very purposefully, whatever it means to you. Because what we found was that for people who supported the president, and for Republican women, in fact, to your point, they said they were primarily concerned with how he managed the government. But for Democratic women, it became much more personal. It became about whether or not he shared their culture and values, they told us, or even how he handled himself personally. So that can be an issue that affects them as well. So sometimes you want to leave it open because you want to listen to people rather than impose something on them and say, check the box, yes or no. And again, to sort of reemphasize, the differences here are subtle. We're talking about single digits between moderates and Republicans, all of which could and very well might shift as we go on, but it defines the contours of what people are going to argue about.
That hospital food, airplane food line, I think it's pretty accurate.
It's pretty Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. We will be back in just a moment to talk some more with Anthony Salvanto about understanding polling. At CBS, we've been lucky to be able to turn to Anthony Salvanto to help us make sense of polling and the science behind those numbers. Now, Anthony's sharing his wisdom with everyone in his new book, Where Did You Get That Number? And he's going to help unveil the mysteries of polling. Anthony, thank you for taking the time. It's an interesting read, and you talk with that, you open with that pivotal moment on the night of the 2016 election when so many people started saying, well, the pollsters, they didn't predict this. They got it wrong. What do you think is the biggest misconception, though, about polls?
Yeah, one of them is that it's that they're predictions. They're not predictions. I don't presume to tell people what they're going to think. My job is to understand what people think now and why they think it. I think too often, whether it's in the coverage of polling or even sometimes the way we talk about it, we make it sound like we're covering a horse race and we're the scorekeepers.
We want the bottom line.
Yeah, people just ask, well, who's going to win? As though that single number, the leader in a poll, tells you the whole story. Even today, if we say, okay, the Democrats are leading in the race for the House, that doesn't mean they're going to win. It means that's where things stand now. And in a lot of ways, I think that's more powerful and a better use of polling, because when people ask how these things work, what they really want to know is, who are these people around me? Well, you saw even in the panel where people were talking to each other and say, well, I didn't know that about you, or now I understand you a little bit better. In some ways, when we see the polling and people are telling us, this is what I think and this is why they think it, those are the things that people really want to know, So our job as pollsters, you should judge us, but you should judge us not on whether we predict the world, but on whether we explain it.
And people's thinking evolves with events and over time. You put an analogy in the book of polling in your grandmother's bolognese sauce. Yeah. Explain that.
Yeah. Well, look, pollsters have always said that what we do is try to create a microcosm of the country in our polling samples. And that's how polls work. Because people ask me all the time, well, how do you talk to 1,000 or 2,000 people and know the whole country? I mean, it's counterintuitive, and that's a really good question.
And who are these people?
And who are they? And who do you talk to? And how do we find them? So the example that I use is, well, you can do this with a sample. And my grandmother used to sit around and be there on Sundays, and she'd make this giant vat of spaghetti sauce. And if we wanted to know how it tasted, it always tasted really good, by the way, everybody would get a bowl. And you didn't need to eat the entire vat of spaghetti sauce to know how it tasted. You were sampling it. Well, what's the mechanism behind that? It's that the meatball that you got tasted like the meatballs that you didn't eat from the vat, or even the grain of salt were like the other grains of salt. Well, in a polling sample, what you're doing is bringing together Republicans and Democrats and people young and old and of every different sort. So when people say, well, you didn't call me for the poll, or you didn't talk to anyone, that I know, well, we probably talked to somebody like you and somebody who could represent you. If you're a Republican, there are millions of other Republicans we could bring in.
As we're learning.
As we're learning. So, there's certain power in that we can be represented in our views by somebody else who's like us in the sample.
How honest are people? Do they lie?
No, they don't lie. And I think because, most people are decent and honest, they don't realize how much work it would take to lie. First of all, why would you spend 10 minutes on the phone?
But you do talk about a reluctance to sometimes be fully candid about who you're voting for.
Well, the reluctance in the sense of, and I think this is playing out right now, actually, in 2018 as well. When we see Republicans today telling us that they're not necessarily voting for a Republican candidate, they're telling us that they're unsure. So they're certainly not lying. They're telling us they haven't made up their mind quite yet. But the way we should read that number, even if it's just 5 or 10% of them who are saying that, is we should say, well, they're already conservative and they voted Republican in the past. So is that a group that we shouldn't be surprised if they ultimately come home and vote for Republicans? No, we shouldn't. And that's a way to look at polling as an entire dynamic, so of telling you what could happen in the world. So when people answer and say that they're unsure, we take them at their word, but we should also look at other characteristics about them and think, well, what might they do and what else are they going to decide on?
Watch them and see which way they swing. And we know you'll be doing that, Anthony, with these upcoming midterms for us. So thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.